Okay, everyone. I think we'll get started. We're just waiting for Heather, but I'm sure she's on her way in now. That's told her. Come on, Heather. Okay, that's a great session this morning already. Lots of interesting things to pick up on, I think, later on. And now we're into a physical session, I think, for the two papers and a performance. So some of those thoughts about how dialogue might be effective and physical and haptic and multisensory, I'm sure will be raised by thinking about this performance and the papers that we're going to hear. So for the next quarter of an hour, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes for questions at the end of this performance, we've got Tem Estes, and he's going to perform with colleagues, and the title of it is EMOTICON. He's based in the UK and in the US, so I'm just going to hand straight over. Tom. One really important thing before we carry on, the camera. There's a very small camera going around the audience. Please, can you take photographs quickly and as many as possible and pass it on? That's part of the performance, okay? Tom, do you want to come back in and take a few questions? We've certainly got 5 minutes. Okay. Thoughts? Comments?
Hi. I thought that was really interesting, given that we finished off the last panel talking about gesture. And obviously, EMOTICON, that's what the work, the title is. And so I suppose I'd be interested in hearing a bit more about that, and if you can relate it to what we've been talking about, would be great.
Okay. Partly, I suppose it's, for me, it's part of the dialogue of performance. And I think a lot of performance is about presenting, you know, saying, I am here, I am a person, you know, bloodletting, a lot of things like that. Or instead, I'm wearing a uniform, which in a way bestows a kind of status, but at the same time, it's quite dehumanizing, in the same way that a mask is dehumanizing. And I'm interested in the relationship between humans and computers. And, you know, of course, now we have facial recognition systems, you know, and robotics are coming along quite a lot. So how gesture is used in communication I think there's a lot of questions around that. Any other questions? The communal camera. Have you all taken pictures? The communal camera is a very important part of the work as well.
I don't think it's got very far, has it? Has it been across to the side? No.
It's about engaging the audience and having them, in a way, being part of what's happening. Also, it's what I call harnessing the hive, which is you get people engaged. And I think there's an interesting thing going on there where you have community engagement, but at the same time, there's a kind of funny questions around that as well, in terms of, well, I don't know, being part of something and not being different, I suppose.
What do you plan to do with the images?
I put them online, okay. And so they become part of something for another wider audience who haven't physically been in the space. So the people who've witnessed it and taken pictures, if you have, are kind of part of the work.
I just had a quick question about the actual gestures, and kind of, I was thinking about sign language as you were doing the performance, and I wondered whether, well, it's something that hasn't kind of come up yet in the talk about translation, so I'm interested in that, but also where you kind of took the gestures from.
Well, there are two kinds of gestures. There are learned gestures and there are unconscious gestures. You know, like the thumbs up is a learned one. It's a cultural thing. Whereas if you touch your face in a funny way, you know, when you're thinking or whatever, that's unconscious. So that's the basis of what I was doing. But I found a really hilarious article online from Wired, and it was how to look like an intellectual when you're doing a talk. Yeah. So the sweeping gesture is, for instance, talking about hierarchies, or the hand, when you're twisting the hand kind of like this, it's like, oh, the dialectic, or, you know. So I thought in this context, that was kind of, you know, an interesting kind of, for me anyway, a bit funny.
You mean the dialectic?
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because in a sense, we're all part of the art world, and the art world is about a kind of critique of institutions, but we're in an institution ourselves, and we all play roles within that institution as well. So, you know, it's life, isn't it? There's always a kind of hypocrisy in everything we do, and there's kind of no escape from it in some sense. So, you know, all you can do in a way is laugh, I think, sometimes, you know. But there we are. Anyone else?
Yes, my name is Susanne Palzer. I need my neighbor to hold the microphone. Because I want to ask you, Tom, what was kind of, what was it, this gesture?
Which one?
Am I doing it right?
Oh, well, that was the, making a point gesture.
Okay, and
whereas where in the academia, it's usually the flat hand on the palm saying, "I've made this point before." Apparently, according to Wired, anyway.
Thank you. And the second question is, do you get people who recognize those gestures?
I don't think people do necessarily, because they are unconscious gestures. So you probably do recognize them, but when they're taken out of context, when you don't have an actual conversation going on, where you can't see my face, it isolates them, and it makes them something other in a way, and that's part of the performance. So.
Yeah, I asked because I felt I have seen that before, but I could not pinpoint it.
But you kind of can't quite work it out. Yeah, and that's kind of part of it. Yeah.
Thank you.
I had a question about Star Wars, because in my memory it was C-3PO and R2-D2 who had the best dialogue in the whole film and were the most loved of all the characters in the film. And C-3PO does speak in English or Globish, and does gesture and has human form, but R2-D2 just sort of
beeps and bobs.
Yeah, and yet that was conversation that was actually transcultural, and it sort of reached. It was one of the first big global mega hits since, for many decades. And I just wondered, can you speak about that?
They are lovable characters, aren't they? In the films, I think they're sweet. And the mask I wear, the Cyberman, is actually not. It's from a completely different storyline, and they're hostiles, aren't they? So I kind of wanted to play a little bit with that, to the ambiguity of it, of the robot, of the cyborg, as technology being something that's a bonus for our lives, but it also, there's a lot of problems and a lot of questions around it. So I wanted to evidence that.
Should we take another question? At the back there.
Hi, I'm Emma. Just following on from your question about what the gestures were, they kind of made me think they were more for when someone's kind of making a speech, or it's a bit more kind of like that. So I'm wondering, do you think about more intimate conversations, dialogues and gestures?
Well, the woman next to you is making a gesture. She has her hand to her mouth. I mean, everyone in this room is making gestures all the time, whether you notice it or not. But yeah, I mean, within this context, I was thinking about making a speech, as I said, the kind of academia, kind of.
Okay, so this is the last one.
Okay.
I just wanted to, because it's so different to what you did last time in dialogue, and sorry for those people who didn't come, but you had people eating donuts, so it was a very physical kind of presence, and it was much more about a dialogue, I suppose, with you and the audience. So I don't know whether.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think in that manifestation, because food, and people eating the food afterwards, yeah. But in terms of my practice, I mean, the whole concept behind the donuts, I was poking, for anyone who doesn't know, I was poking holes in donuts, wearing a doctor's kind of jacket and a tie. And so it was the same kind of thing, wearing a kind of uniform, but also it's a meaningless act, isn't it, poking holes in donuts? And it actually comes from, well, it is, isn't it? I mean, so it's kind of doing nothing, isn't it? And in a sense, this is the same, isn't it? I'm a human being who's dressed up as a cyborg in a kind of uniform, but gesturing in a way that no one can quite understand. So, yeah.
Sort of communication, you're trying to communicate, but communicating nothing, so it's like this dysfunctional, kind of like you're taking it removed from,
yeah.
So that's all.
Well, I'm kind of interested in the concept of nothingness, because I think that's the way the human brain works, is quite often when you have such little information to process. What you end up doing is putting meanings onto things and creating meanings, and the human brain needs to kind of file things away and put things away and have a place for it. So it's a way of getting people's attention in a way. If you want people to hear, you know, whisper, they say. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tom. Actually, rather than being about nothingness, it struck me as it was absolutely well overloaded with messages and signs and things. So that was what was confusing me, rather than the fact that you were it was a kind of dysfunctional kind of set of gestures. I'm kind of intrigued to see what's written on your shirt, on your...
it's just the maker, it's a
yeah, but it's not just a maker, is it? You know, what is it?
It is a fireman's
Is it?
outfit.
Oh, right, because
yeah,
the uniform
fireman's.
is really specific, isn't it? Obviously, you know, uniforms have got very powerful messages, haven't they? I didn't know that was a fireman's uniform.
Well, going back to the question about the, you know, C-3PO and that, you know, the fireman is someone who saves people. He's the good guy, isn't he?
Yeah.
You know, but the Cyberman, he's a bad guy.
Right.
So, you know, it's kind of, I'm a bit of both here, you know, good guy and bad guy.
Okay. Well, thanks, Tom. That was great. So I think we'll move on now. So thanks again. Should we just thank Tom for his performance? Thanks. I'm sure we'll be coming back to some of the messages that were emblazoned in that performance. So now we've got we're going to move to a slightly different tone and register, I think. And we have Sophie. Just go back to my program here. Okay, so our next presentation is the Tender Space Theatre Dialogue and Responsibility from Sophie Bush. And Sophie's now a lecturer at Sheffield Hallam University, and she's interested in aspects of physicality and theatre and dialogue. So over to you, Sophie, and then we should have...
Thank you very much. Am I all right? Presumably you can hear me speaking into this one. Yeah. I'm now completely paranoid that every academic gesture I make is going to be analysed, so I'll try not to fiddle too much. I'm interested in the word tender. To be tender is to be gentle, affectionate, compassionate, loving, but it is also to be sore, painful, bruised. This creates a paradox, but tender and its variants have many other meanings too. In the English language, there are two nouns. Tender, someone who looks after another person, place or thing. One noun that means that, and the verb to tender, to offer, propose or bid. It also has two verbs, to tend, meaning to look after or care for, and to tend, meaning to incline. The etymology of the latter, as well as of the verb tender, is the Middle English tendon, from the Old French tendre, which means to stretch or extend. And the etymology of the verb tend, to look after, as well as the noun tender, has a different root, the Middle English attendon, from the Old French attendre, to wait, expect, or heed. However, both the Old French attendre and the French tendre share the same Latin root, the verb tendir. Again, my Latin's not great, so tendir, meaning to stretch, extend, proceed, or hold forth. It's not difficult to see how this word that means to stretch or extend might develop in both that literal physical sense, to tend meaning to incline, lean, or tilt, and also in that more abstract sense, tender meaning to offer, tend to offer one's services. But what of our adjective tender, from which the noun tenderness as well as the adverb tenderly are both drawn? These are also derived from the Old French tendre, which, like the English tender, had another definition, young, delicate, and soft. However, the Latin root of this was not the verb tendir, but the adjective tenere, tenere, tenerum. Thus, in its first Latin instance, the gentle adjective tender, or tenir, was not linked to the reaching verb tender or tendir, but by the time we reach the Old French, we find that dual verb adjective tendre, which refers to both concepts, as with the English tender. And so, I hope that it's not too audacious to propose and to argue over the course of this paper that if to tender is to stretch, extend, incline, essentially to reach out to the other, to be tender is to reach out to that other. I propose that tenderness is created in the space between the offer and the response, the tenderer and the responder. And my thesis is that that concept of tenderness, the word expanded to encompass all those aspects of the word tender, can be seen as the foundation of an ethical relationship based fundamentally on reciprocity and incorporating elements of Emmanuel Levinas's concept of responsibility, Adriana Cavarero's notion of the inclining subject, Martin Buber's philosophy of I-you, and Augusto Boal's formulation of theatre as dialogue. And this is my second audacious proposal, that whilst tenderness is more commonly seen as a physical quality, and the process of stretching or extending or reaching out is deeply imbued with physicality, that one way to reach out is to speak out. To tender is to offer, is to speak out. To be tender is to be in dialogue. The playwright Timberlake Wertenbaker has suggested that if a culture loses its language, oh, sorry, I missed some things there, but never mind, has suggested that if a culture loses its language, it loses its tenderness. It's a strange turn of phrase, but one that's carefully chosen, and a similar equation is made in her play, The Love of the Nightingale. When you love, you want to imprison the one you love in your words, in your tenderness. So what is it about language that Wertenbaker associates with tenderness? Elsewhere, she makes a reverse association between silence and brutality. Silence leads to violence, she says. Without language, brutality will triumph. And if we accept more readily that silence is brutal, why not that language is tender? I want to explore that proposition. The Brazilian theatre practitioner Augusto Boal also writes tenderly of the tenderness of words. I love this quote. Words are living entities and should be treated with the same tenderness as human beings. They're alive, they breathe, they can be happy and they can suffer. We have to teach our partners to love words, to choose the ones they prefer to signify each particular idea or feeling or emotion they have, to utter them meaningfully. Words are a language, and so is the voice, and so is the body in space, and so are our eyes, the most vulnerable part of our bodies. Furthermore, Boal considers that theatre is the human language par excellence. In fact, he proposes that the being becomes human when it discovers theatre. Thus, if, as Boal argues, theatre is our most valuable language, and if, as Wertenbaker suggests, language is tenderness, the possibility begins to emerge that we might be able to conceptualize theatre space as tender space. In language and dialogue, in tenderness and in theatre, reciprocity is vital for success. Consequently, tenderness, like dialogue and theatre, means risk. It leaves you open, exposed, vulnerable. You can tender, you can offer, but there may be no response, no answer, no one may reach back. Yet if we allow ourselves to be unduly preoccupied by that risk, we're missing the point. In her article on witnessing and testimony, Kelly Oliver recognises that to communicate is indeed to open oneself, but warns that that openness is not complete if it is on the watch for recognition. It is complete not in the opening to the spectacle of or the recognition of the other, but in becoming a responsibility for him. Yet whilst our concern is to offer the other our responsibility, not to await theirs, reciprocity is still ideal in Oliver's model, as she states that our fundamental obligation is to respond to others in ways that open up rather than close off their responses. Oliver's work, particularly her focus on responsibility, draws on the work of the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, who cites responsibility as the essential, primary, and fundamental structure of subjectivity. For Levinas, this responsibility is invoked by the essential human peculiarity of the face-to-face encounter. Without using the term directly, Levinas highlights the face's dual tenderness, that is, the paradox of its naked vulnerability, literally woundability from the Latin vulnus, meaning wound, and its commanding unwoundability. The face is exposed, menaced as if inviting us to an act of violence, he explains. At the same time, the face is what forbids us to kill. Elsewhere, he uses the term proximity, which he defines as not simply close to me in space or close like a parent, but responsible for the other, which again seems to bear some connotations of tenderness. He also links this concept explicitly to dialogue, stressing the face's other essential function. The face speaks, and thus renders possible and begins all discourse. For For Levinas, it is discourse as opposed to vision, and more exactly response or responsibility, that forms the authentic relationship between men. Although dialogue and discourse are essential for Levinas's authentic relationship to occur, for him as for Oliver, the intersubjective relationship is a non-symmetrical relation where one is responsible for the other without waiting for reciprocity. And I'm going to return to that idea in my subsequent discussion of Adriana Cavarero's work on the inclining subject. Bearing some relation to Levinas's conception of responsibility is Martin Buber's notion of the basic word I-you. Buber argues that when a being, I, addresses the other as you rather than it, he enters into an encounter of perfect relation and reciprocity that can only exist between the two entities, not within either. Likewise, Buber argues that love, which we could perhaps read as tenderness, does not cling to an I as if the you were merely a content or object. It is between I and you, a force or energy existing between two people, not the feeling of one person directed towards another. Buber continues, using language even closer to Levinas's, stating, love is responsibility of an I for a you. Although Buber's philosophy makes much of the act of speaking and describes this essential relationship in terms of a basic word, it is clear that the act of you saying is not a simple vocal pronouncement, but an all-encompassing assertion that involves bodily and spatial as well as linguistic dimensions. The basic I-you can be spoken with one's whole being, he insists. Whoever says one of the basic words and enters into the word and stands in it. This trinity of the linguistic, the bodily, and the spatial aligns Buber's you-saying somewhat with the theatrical act, and later he makes that connection more explicit, describing the it world, the world of I-it relationships, as a firm and wholesome chronicle, in contrast to the which you moments appear as queer, lyric dramatic episodes. Another point of resonance is found in Buber's repeated reference to the reaching and stretching of the I toward the you. For example, believe in the simple magic of life, in the service in the universe, and it will dawn on you that what this waiting, peering, stretching of the neck of the creature means. Every word must falsify, but look, these beings live around you, and no matter which one you approach, you always reach being. Buber defines an I as that which reaches for, but is not a you, and returns to this phrasing frequently, particularly in his description of the process by which the child encounters the world, by seeing, listening, feeling, forming. It is in encounter that the creation reveals its formhood. It does not pour itself into senses that are waiting, but deigns to meet those that are reaching out. For Buber, this act of reaching is then explicitly connected to the need for reciprocity and seemingly synonymously with tenderness. In the drive for contact, originally a drive for tactile contact and then also for optical contact with another being, the innate you comes to the fore quite soon, and it becomes ever clearer that the drive aims at reciprocity, at tenderness. Buber then continues, but it, that drive for contact, reciprocity and tenderness, also determines the inventive drive, which emerges later, the drive to produce things synthetically, or where that's not possible, analytically, through taking or tearing apart. And thus the product is personified, and a conversation begins. Thus, following that very deliberate equation of tenderness and reciprocity, that drive for contact, reciprocity, and tenderness is positioned as the determiner for the inventive or creative drive, which includes the drive to produce, and by extension to produce art or theatre, and the drive to tear apart or to analyse. Despite Buber's use of that emotive language of tearing apart, with its connotations of cruelty and tenderness in the form of pain, he doesn't seem to use the phrase negatively. Analysis or tearing apart might be positioned as being less desirable than synthesis or putting together, but neither are criticised. In fact, it seems that it's these dual processes that offer the possibility of conversation. Perhaps we can see our role as academics in these terms, especially as academics in theatre or the arts, where we're involved in both the making and the tearing apart, the facilitation of that conversation. And to extrapolate back, perhaps we can describe these processes as innately reciprocal and innately tender. We create with tenderness. Our tearing apart leaves tenderness behind, a cyclical and reciprocal process. The child in the womb provides Buber with the absolute metaphor for responsibility, natural association, and bodily reciprocity. And it's perhaps not surprising that that mother-child relationship is so often described as tender. This forms the underlying concern of the final theoretical perspective I want to consider today, that of the feminist philosopher Adriana Cavarero, as outlined in her paper, Inclining the Subject, Ethics, Alterity and Natality. Cavarero's interest is in exploring an ontological perspective that aims at contrasting the ideology of individualism through an essential focus on relationality and dependence, and tends to reorientate the scene from its vertical axis to a horizontal one. But, Cavarero argues, the horizontal reorientating of the scene is in fact open to diverse configurations. It could resolve in a paradigm of flat horizontality, thought in terms of interdependence and ideal reciprocity, but it could also resolve in a much more radical gesture of giving every self, not necessarily in turn or on a mutual basis, to the unilateral inclination of the other, neither vertical nor horizontal, yet given over, exposed, offered, inclined to the other. Thus we are returned to a definition of tending that has hitherto seemed somewhat detached from the others we've explored. To tend is to incline, or to reiterate Cavarero's words, to be given over, exposed, offered, inclined to the other. Cavarero's exploration of this inclined subjectivity engages with feminist debates around the ethics of care and interrogates the controversial idea of oblative motherhood as epitomised by the figure of the Virgin Mary. Cavarero describes the other who appears on the maternal scene of care as the one who lies in the warm fold of the embrace and is still infant, vulnerable creature, tender child. But although it is the child who is vulnerable, woundable, and therefore tender, it is the mother who is bent over him, inclined, and therefore tender. Thus, simultaneously, we are offered two types of tenderness, that of the vulnerable and of the protector, of the carer and the cared for. Alongside this double tenderness, Cavarero highlights that for all who care, even and especially the mother, there is always an alternative between care and wound, and it is this alternative of which inclination properly consists. Cavarero critiques the idea of oblative motherhood, asserting that the mother who bends over the infant actually is not yet a response, only a predisposition to respond, and offers Medea as the alternative extreme of inclination to the Virgin Mary, still inclined towards and responsive to her offspring, but responding with violence and wounding rather than caring. The alternative between care and wound, between love and violence, to which Cavarero draws our attention, and which she insists is entirely inscribed within the inclination, turned outwards, bending over, responsive, typical of a self that leans out over the other, conspicuously abandoning its own balance, may be the final key to resolving our initial paradox, whereby tenderness is both love and compassion, bruising and pain. I hope this paper has begun to demonstrate a series of potential connections between dialogue, tenderness, and theatre. This project's still in a very early stage, and given that and the brief time today, I've been able to do little more than begin to map out that territory. If I've not yet convincingly argued that these connections exist, I hope I've at least convinced you that they're worth exploring further, because I propose that a language of tenderness is an ethical language, a language of dialogue, not monologue, and of reciprocity, even if that reciprocity is varyingly inclined. Because I propose we cannot give or receive tenderness without reaching out to the other, and because I believe that theatre space is tender space, a space of reciprocity, of dialogue, a space where one encounters the face of the other and can address him as you. Thank you.
Can you hear? Sorry, yeah. Thanks for that. Not very tender response, but that was a really rich examination, I think, of the notion of tenderness as having a relationship to dialogue, and thinking about risk and vulnerability, and particularly playing into the points which Grant was talking about last night, I suppose, in terms of how we reconfigure or how we think about self and other.
So it's for the next one.
We've got some technological things happening. Is that right? Okay. We've got 5 minutes for questions. It was lots of really interesting kind of concepts raised there. Heather? Yeah.
Hi, it's Rachel from this morning. I wanted just to hear more of your views on this idea of the space in between that you mentioned quite early on, and what that kind of means to you in terms of the translation and understanding of your, concept, really.
I suppose it's something that was coming across as being quite crucial to a lot of the philosophical and theoretical positions I was looking at. So that in well, I suppose again coming initially from a theatrical perspective, the space in between performers on stage and between a performer on stage and the audience is, I think, often where a lot of that kind of the idea of presence or of energy or of like the theatrical moment happens, and it's quite sort of intangible and undefinable, but it's that relationship between performers or between performers and an audience. So I kind of had that that sense before I started that was, and also it was coming from like what I was looking at with the etymology as well, that I was particularly interested in the etymology of tender to offer, and so to offer and to respond, and that was a process that had to happen between two people or more. And then that was being re-emphasised in the things I was reading, so in Buber's idea of the I-you and the kind of the energy that exists between when you say you to someone else, or address them as a you. And in other concepts like Levinas's concept of responsibility. Sorry, am I answering your question?
Yeah, I was thinking about it, I suppose, from more of a translational perspective as well, as to, I suppose it applies more to the word tender and offering that you were saying, in terms of how each person understands something differently, and it's that space in between.
What, in between different understandings?
Yeah.
I think I hadn't been... Translation is something that I've looked at in the past, and I hadn't particularly been looking at it with this project, but sitting here this morning and last night, that was something that, you know, was starting to filter through, and that sense of like, what's communicated between words in the body language or in the sort of silences in between, is definitely something else to look at, I think, but it's I guess not something I was thinking about very much in relation to this until today, really.
Picking up a bit on that, the silences in between, there was a phrase that you used, which I'm not sure if, I think it was a quote from someone else, about the brutality of silence. And I just wanted to kind of interrogate that a bit more, because I think it's something that's going to recur through the days, thinking about the unspoken as well as the spoken in dialogue. And I wondered if you could talk a bit more about when silence is brutal, or the kind of idea of being silenced, and then the kind of opposition to that, where silence might be a choice or a kind of have a power to it. The communicative power as well. The
quote was from the playwright Timberlake Wertenbaker, and she was very influenced by the fact that she was born in America, but she grew up in the Basque region of France at a point where the Basque language was being systematically devalued, and children were told not to speak Basque in school, and they were stupid if they spoke Basque. And so she kind of had this, from a very early age, this fear of kind of being silenced, or of losing a language. And then as she kind of got older, she sort of saw that happening in other places. She talked about, you know, it happening in South Africa during apartheid, and in kind of other places where, and then that sense of silence leading to violence was kind of, again, what she'd witnessed in terms of people being driven to acts of terrorism or violence as the only way of being able to make their voices heard, because they weren't being heard politically or in kind of more productive forums. And that's, you know, that's a tension that's in a lot of her plays. In terms of silence being a choice, it's not, I think again, kind of my previous research is on Wertenbaker, which is why she's sort of, I'm moving away from it, but it's a frame of reference to me. She explores, in her early work, it's very much that language, like linguistic language, is important. And then in some of her later work, she starts to explore concepts of non-verbal language and other ways of making yourself heard. So I think that seems to have been something that she was starting to think about and look at as well, and something that I've kind of noticed in the way her work progresses. And certainly with the what I'm looking at here, I'm looking at moments on stage that are not necessarily verbally linguistic, but or not necessarily a verbal language, but that may include moments of connection and communication and dialogue that aren't necessarily verbalized or linguistic. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Michael. I was drawn to the definition of vulnerability as woundability, and that idea that we spoke of last night of the slipperiness and dangerousness of friendship, and how I think somebody said last night that our capacity to love and hate often commingle, and that idea of wounding and repairing. And I wondered if you looked at any of the work of Jean Genet and his idea of the wound, in terms of the tenderness that you described at the beginning of pain and bruising.
I do know some of Genet's plays, but I haven't specifically looked at his concept of wounding, so thank you for that. I will take that away. Yeah, I thought that linked in with what Grant said yesterday, because he was also talking about Levinas's work as well, and that idea of when he was drawing on Levinas at the same point, wasn't he, when he made those points that you were talking about, which has been an influence for this as well. So, that fine line between the kind of something that's soft and vulnerable and gentle being appealing and causing an impulse to want to look after it, and also something being powerless and therefore, the possibility exists to harm instead of to care for is a tension in certainly in Levinas, but also in Cavarero, the Italian philosopher that I'm looking at as well. So, but thank you for the Genet. I'll go away and look at that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sophie, for a really interesting paper, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of those issues and questions. We've got to move on because we've got the last presentation now. Yeah. So we'll move on swiftly. Monika? So next we've got this is our final paper before lunch, which is at 1:30. Just while they're getting sorted, I'll just mention that while we've got a moment, if anyone wants to go to Edin's for brunch on Sunday, we've booked the 3rd floor. It's Edin's Natural Kitchen in Nottingham, and if you want to go, please tell Michael, and Michael's there. So please catch him, because he needs to know how many people want to go so he can book it. Okay. So we're moving on now to Monika Jaeckel. Is that right? Yep. And she's an artist and writer from Berlin, and we're continuing with the kind of theme which we've got in this series of papers and performances, which is around the haptic and physicality, following on Sophie's. Unless we've got a problem. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, it's yours.
summarizes by this her idea about how touch, the aspect of touching upon something or being touched, affect movement. This conditional relation also of touch also influences the way of orientation. It may be as subtle as to just affect breathing, as for me at the moment, or bumping against the wall, or even, yeah, that idea of bumping against the wall. Oh, sorry, yeah, I forgot that. Eventually, the entire sense of being is affected, as one just noticed, and with it, the lines of movement which define the ways of knowing in and of this world. Response is thus essential to touch. Imagine the pre-verbal infant who just crawls and explores their surrounding by climbing, touching, and eventually even trying to bite or chew on things. In this state, the infant quite literally takes the effects of touch as effective impulses of world-making. The emerging effect of touch sways knowledge through the experience of contact. Limits may deviate from a presumed form or line, influencing thus movement per se or movement of thought, which was expected to continue unimpeded. This responsibility, often towards others and matters in general, constitutes each of us, is how Barat describes the interdependence of matter and matter in general, which is enacted in the process of an encounter. Defining matter and us in the sense of world-making and world-becoming in a specific moment of interaction incites mattering as meaning. Barat, on her background as a physicist, based on her interest on her background as a physicist, Barat's interest for quantum mechanics led her to specify interaction through the neologism of intra-action. Her purpose is not simply to transpose quantum mechanics insights analogically onto the macro world, but to attempt epistemological and ontological approach to certain phenomena. The moment of touching contact could be seen as such an interaction, as a cutting together apart, which is a defining moment of difference. And to come all together a little bit in dialogue, I would like to ask you to join me into a little experiment. That means lift one arm, which one is up to you, and put it on the shoulder or the arm of the person next to you or in front of you. You can also take the chair if there's no person. Rest for a moment and take a breath. Then come back to yourself. You can take the hand back. This little interaction might have shifted your body attention a little bit. It might also have gotten you a little bit out of your internal monologue just by getting in touch with something next to you or somebody next to you. Touch can be understood as the defining moment that creates contact and exchange. It is a chiasmic entanglement of attractive, repulsive responses, establishing a certain structure of matter ring. This relational constitution is often interpreted as a one-sided self-definition by extending our anthropocenic view onto the world around, an act that is widely understood as to be initiated and rationalized only by us, as if others, human or non-human, would not play a necessary and important part precisely because of their non-predictable response ability in the situation of mattering to which we relate. Contrary to this self-centric view, matter and the others are not just needed as a relational background, background in quotes, that allows a measuring and locating of a lone and still most likely Western human figure. It is this vital surrounding that manifests mattering based on the mutuality of exchange and that needs such a response. The philosopher Alva Noe, he's also based in California, points out a similar fact that dancers regarding their engagement with the audience enact an environment of possibilities for them. Okay. From a different angle, but to a certain congruence to Barat, he states that the environment is brought forth by us. Our surrounding is one whose meaning is always specified relative to us and the situation. Even in a performance, when a performance is staged like this in a predefined setting, the resonance called up by the movement of the dancers opens a field of potential action, and that is why Noah says we see the environment when we see dance. Thus, while you are sitting here, you not only move through different sitting positions, you're also moved in a certain way by the movement of others, that is the dancers. Even staying in touch over a long distance, either in time or space, entails a sort of mutual exchange. As already the manifold meanings of especially the English word, I'm a non-native speaker, suggest it does not necessarily need to be literally a literal way of touching to create contact. Tap, tap, swipe, tap. This is a quite common gesture nowadays, and it is how we most likely today often come in contact with others via digital interfaces. It's a literal relation is created via technological devices that allow interaction. Today, this often implies to touch upon a screen to get in touch with somebody else. But the tactile experience of impacting the smooth surface of glass or plastic almost is ignored. Touching a touch screen addresses the responsiveness we desire, but seems less affecting than being pointed as if being pointed with a laser pointer. So you might be annoyed by this, as it's like a little animal on your body and you want to wipe it away. Go away. But still, it is not unimportant what touches on what, as only some materials react in the presumed way to each other. Eve Kosowski-Sedgwick remarks in her book Touching Feeling that texture, despite its grounding reference with touch, involves more than one sense, and consequently it has to be considered that, that's now quoting her, the different properties and radical divergent modern histories of different perceptual systems talk and splay the history of texture as well. Albeit she says that the sense of physical touch itself has been remarkably unsusceptible to being amplified by technology, but this was in 2003, and that's been quite a while since then. The sensational extension of affect enabled by current technology through its prolonged connectivity seems but to mitigate the sensation of touch into routines of a coded performance. In that it counters what Karen Barat defines is essential for the ability to respond, and that is the non-calculability. Response ability, as addressed by Barat, entails an incalculability as touching does. Even when acted out often and becoming a habit, its affective side yields response. This relation to responsibility makes it a mutual exchange, a performative encounter of constituting. Its effectivity might suddenly lead to an effect of something unprecedented and unexpected. Certainly also your mobile phone might fail might fail to react in the expected way, but most likely by becoming only annoyingly unresponsive. The interesting twist that habit per se is a trained procedure but can be intercepted enables parkour runners, when we have one among us, to approach an environment very differently than the average person might do in a daily routine. Adaptation to the built habitat is based on the runner's trained abilities, allowing them to react in the instant of a momentarily movement interaction. In Barat's words, it is an integral relation that does not appear through the realization of some existing possibility, but through the iterative reworking of possibility, an ongoing rupture, a cross-cutting of topological reconfigurations. Extending these meanderings onto the proposition of this talk asks to consider also associations and thoughts as embodied. Karen Barat states that thought experiments are dependent on cognitive processes and as they are situated and experienced in forms of interaction and as equivalent to material matter. This understanding of the underlying movement interaction brings forth differently layered tendencies of knowing. Theory and verbal dialogues appear now as a transposition familiar with other forms of movement, which constitute just different forms of mattering and matter, and one of them is thought. To get in touch means to get in dialogue, which due to the paradigmatic nature of any dialogical exchange is always transitory, as is the touching moment of response. These encounters create a resonance of difference, a cutting together apart of the self within the other and the other within the self, thus defining self and the surrounding. Sorry, I need quickly to activate something. And acknowledging the own dependency on the reality of things demands an ethics that respects the other form. It means to see the environment. To be open to responsibility means to perceive this wall over there as a parkour person would, not as a confining, but standing for a possibility to create an experience of bouncing off in an unexpected way. Equally, this presentation is informed and shaped by a proposition of motion that accesses both in talking and movement as an interdependent dialogical forms. It is an experiment that attempts the fragile appearance and experience of this touching moment as dialogical matter of responsibility in a wider sense. And coming to an end, it was just accidentally that I found in the leaflet of the former exhibition by Dan Vo, who stated then, for what is the initiator for his works, to me, things come out of the continuous dialogue you have with your surroundings. So they don't come from internal. Okay, we have another experiment going on, and I'm not sure if it's working, but...
Thanks, that's absolutely amazing. Thank you very much.
Yeah. These are my 3 dancers, and they will continue a little bit up there, eventually outside. It should have been a live streaming, which obviously doesn't work at the moment. I apologize for this, but who wants can follow them, and maybe they can return after a little bit.
Thanks, Monika. It was absolutely fantastic. It's a real shame we've not got time to have questions and things, because unfortunately we've got to. Yeah, we'll do that later. But it was absolutely amazing, I think, especially after the analysis and talking about some of these ideas. Really was fantastic. So we need to finish now, and 12:30 until 12:15.
It's
Sorry.
2:15.
2:15. So we're back in here at 2:15, but you need to take your belongings and everything. I'll just pass over to.
Yeah. The space has got to be shut so that Jim can have a break, and so you need to take your things with you. We will have tea and coffee in the break after lunch. So if you need to sort yourselves out for lunch, and then please be back here at 2:15, ready to start, so that we can keep to time. Thank you very much.